The country's chief scientist is Professor Ian Chubb. He joins us from Canberra too. Professor Chubb, good morning. Thank you very much for your time.
Pleasure, Michael.
You've heard those very strong commitments from both sides of politics, but at the same time, as the chief scientist, you argue that an overarching strategy is what is lacking in terms of promoting science. What more needs to be done in this area?
Well, I think the reality for us, Michael, is that we can't do everything we would like to do. We have grown up, indeed I grew up with the idea that you could do what you wanted to do, and we're not doing that particularly well. We don't have the resources to support that. So I think one of the things we need to do is to sit back a little, reflect on what we actually do, reflect on where we do have competitive advantage, reflect on where we do have national need, and make sure that our resources, at least a proportion of our resources, are applied to that end.
Well, in scientific terms, where do we have competitive advantage? What areas should get much more attention?
Well, I think looking at it from the other point of view, there are some things that we have to make sure that we do. So, for example, we talk often about being the food bowl of Asia or the food bowl of the region or any food bowl. So we need to make sure that we're investing enough effort, both in terms of getting students through the system who will work in that area, as well as supporting the research that goes to looking at what sort of grains we might grow when the environment changes around us, the water systems that we need, the soil that we need. All of those things need particular attention. Just as an example, there are other things where we have national needs. I mean, we know about our country and its rainfall patterns, and we know about floods, and we know about droughts, and we know that we use the aquifers. We've got to make sure that we manage those aquifers well. So there are all sorts of issues, I think, that are of particular national consequence that we need to make sure that we're doing enough work in.
You mentioned students there, Ian Chubb, is something we talk a lot about on breakfast, the relative lack of engagement by Australian students in science and in comparison, pretty low scores when it comes to scientific achievement, which flows all the way through to university. I suppose it's a bit like turning around a fast-moving cruise liner. How do we go about reversing that trend and getting more kids more interested in science?
Well, I think what we do is we make it compellingly interesting. I mean, I think that we teach science as practiced. Science can be taught boringly, it can be taught straight out of a textbook. The practical classes can be demonstrations or things that the students see the teacher do. The reality is when you're practicing science, you're up to your eyeballs in designing experiments, you're testing hypotheses, you're sitting back and reflecting on the data that you've got. You're turning the data into evidence that supports or rejects your hypothesis, whatever it might be, or rejects your hypothesis more correctly. So I think we've got to teach it differently, and we've got to teach it inspirationally.
In what ways do you argue that there isn't enough flexibility or even imagination in classrooms around the country when it comes to teaching science?
Well, there's a bit of that, and I think that we've got to support our teachers better. I mean, you know, our teaching profession has the future of this country in its hands for a long time, and I think that we've got to make sure that we prepare them well before they go into teaching, and we've got to support them extremely well when they're in service. And science, you know, I have some daughters who studied science. The science that they studied is different from the sciences practiced today. Well, how do you get a teacher who graduated with them teaching science as it is without a lot of professional development and a lot of support? And I think that we've been pretty slack in that.
OK, there's room for improvement there. Now, you heard Ian McFarlane talking about industry engaging more with science, but this is another area where we fall down by international standards. It's something you've raised in the past as well, Ian Chubb, the relative lack of collaboration between business and industry and academia and research agencies. How can that be improved?
Well, again, I think it's a cultural issue. Our universities grew up with academics following particular traditions from overseas. I was one of those. I know what it was like. We did our work, we taught our students, we did our research. We published our research in journals, international journals. We built a reputation as an academic scientist. Now, there's nothing wrong with that. I think that's perfectly appropriate for a substantial number of people to do. Alongside, we should be making sure that we're open to looking at some of the issues that confront our community, which also means the business community, and being more open to engagement with them. And that means looking at how we support academics in our universities, how we promote them, how we how we give them career pathways, all of those sorts of things that we don't do particularly well. On the business side, I don't think that they can just presume that the universities are a publicly subsidised R&D arm for business. They also have to shift their culture a little bit and understand that universities have particular roles they overlap with, but they're not the same as business, and that there is a cost to doing research. So we do need to change the culture on both sides, I think, in order to get where we need to be. And Michael, the OECD produced a report last year that shows provides data that shows that we are 33rd out of 33 countries in terms of business collaboration with higher education.
Which is not good at all in terms of our long-term future. Now, finally, you have expressed concern as well, Ian Chubb, as the Chief Scientist, about opinion and belief overtaking hard facts, cold hard science in too many public debates. How insidious a trend is that in your view?
Well, I think it's a growing one, or at least it has grown over recent years. I mean, we look at the climate change debate and look at the various sides of that argument, and you see a lot of opinion being represented as if it were fact, as if it were scientifically derived fact, and more often than not, it is not. It is, picking a piece of work that suits your particular persuasion, your particular argument. Disparaging the work of scientists who are basically trying to uncover the truth. And I don't think that it serves anybody well to disparage people who are trying to uncover the truth, because you have a completely different agenda that you're not always prepared to articulate.
And the problem here is that experts, therefore, many of whom are diligent, who've spent decades in their field honing their scientific skills, are simply not believed anymore. I mean, how damaging is that? Let's go back to the basic tenet of the conversation. How damaging is that to attempts to get people interested in scientific endeavour in the first place?
Well, the good news, Michael, is that it appears not to be too damaging, because over the last 4 or 5 years, the number of students studying natural and physical sciences at university has increased by 23%. I don't know that, certainly I hadn't predicted that that would happen. It was very flat for the decade before, and over the last 5 years there's been this quite substantial growth, and as far as we know it's showing no signs of slackening off. So it's not having that effect. I mean, maybe it's actually spurring people on to say, well, look, we've got to understand this material. We've got to get out into the community and start to explain to people why science is important, how science is actually done. The fact that science doesn't say I am 100, or a scientist won't say I'm 100% certain that this is, it will rain on Echuca tomorrow afternoon. The fact that they will talk in probabilities can confuse the community a bit. So we've got to actually get out there and explain the work better, but start early so that we don't dump something on the community and say, we're telling you this and you have to believe us because we're scientists, that we take them on the voyage with us so that they know the directions that we're heading, they know that it's ethically conducted science, that the scientists are trying to work in their interests and all of those sorts of things, and do it simply as a matter of course, rather than by headline occasionally.
And I know a lot of people with a scientific background watching us, Ian Chubb, will be nodding in furious agreement at that. Thank you so much for your time this morning.
Okay, pleasure. Thank you.